Before we just start zooming in heavily on sandpaper, which will be fun by the way, I thought it'd be cool to do a deep dive into one of the most commonly used tools in dice making and resin work overall, and that's the sandpaper or polishing agent that we use. I often use Zona Paper and recommend it the most, but there's always high grit sandpapers, as well as a product that Peter Brown and other big YouTubers like to use on their resin work, which is Micromesh. Sometimes instead of just accepting dictums that internet resources tell you this is why this one's better, it's fun to just dive into that yourself and figure it out. For example, I like using Zona Paper because it comes in big sheets and I can cut off exactly how much I want to use. It also has an incredibly wide range of grit sizes, even though that's their own grit system, just like Micromesh uses. Sandpaper has its own grit system as well, but they're all pretty similar. Anybody who's used sandpaper for a while will know that even though this says you can use it wet or dry, if you're using it wet for a long period of time, it kind of sucks. Zona Paper's never had that problem, and you just get so much more in a box. Credit to Sandpaper, however, Zona Papers do not do well in harder materials. Like this dice that has brass in it, I had to actually sand that down with sandpaper because it can do that, and Zona Paper doesn't really sand that stuff away very well. It also is a lot more versatile in that sandpaper you can pretty much buy or find at any store, and you're going to find a billion different styles of that sandpaper, like this Dremel attachment that I have. Both Zona Papers and sandpapers always polish best on an extremely flat surface. That's why I always keep a glass pane around. Also, it makes cool transition shots. Micromesh, on the other hand, comes on this spongy material, so you don't typically have to sand it on a glass pane or something extremely flat. It's got a wide range of grit sizes, although nothing on the low grit end. It's not really good for taking away a large amount of material. This is pretty much entirely for polishing. You can also get it in a sheet like sandpaper or Zona Paper if that's what you prefer, but still you can't get it in very low grits. I typically find Micromesh preferable if I plan on polishing a larger object with the mesh as opposed to moving a smaller object on the mesh to polish. I should clarify and say that I know you can get a similarly high grit sandpaper, but you do have to buy each grit individually at those higher grit values, and that adds a ton to the cost. You also can use Plastex after sanding with sandpaper to get a pretty close shine to that of Zona Papers or Micromesh. In fact, that's what I used to do until I finally got settled on using Zona Papers for my resin work. It works rain or shine, wet or dry, and I find it gives me more uses than sandpaper. While being cheaper than Micromesh, all of this is for me, of course. Your mileage may entirely vary. I also have always felt that sandpaper had a bunch of tiny rocks that left micro scratches on it, you know, the nature of sandpaper, but for some reason didn't feel that way with Zona Papers. I didn't feel that they had rocks in them and therefore were less prone to micro scratching. From a visual inspection, that feels right, but I had no proof of that feeling. But now I can potentially prove that unearned confidence in this product via my new camera. This baby zooms in from 40 to 1,000 times. It's so detailed, in fact, what you're looking at on screen is my arm hair. Yeah, I didn't know it was transparent. I knew it was blonde and I knew I had a lot of it, and that's my thumbprint. Please don't use that to frame me for murders. But what we are going to do is take a good look into sandpaper, Zona Paper, and Micromesh, because I can think all these things and think how they're made and maybe find some stuff online, but sometimes it's really cool to figure that stuff out yourself. So let's zoom in on some 80 grit sandpaper here. And I was kind of right in my thinking, but I'm not entirely right. I always thought that they put glue down and just threw a bunch of really tiny rocks at it. But what it seems like they're doing is putting a bunch of tiny rocks down on some cardstock or paper and throwing glue or paint over that. In this case, this kind of reddish color on these disc-like ones. Moving up to 240 grit, you can already see the rocks have gotten tremendously smaller. Even at 1,000 times zoom, it is much smaller. Coated in this reddish glue paint. I'm not sure what the material is, but it's a lot smoother than I expected it to be. Now let's take a look at a 2,000 grit sheet of sandpaper. The reason I wanted to show this one off is it didn't look like it had any color added. It really kind of just looks like a bunch of rocks on sandpaper. You can even see I sanded some resin on it so you can see how it catches on those rocky edges. At this incredible high level zoom, these are some tiny rocks, and there's actually some weird stuff we'll get into when we look at the Micromesh here at its version of 1,500 grit as we zoom in. Again, I couldn't go any smaller than that one. This one you can immediately see it's different. It's porous. It's almost like a sponge. It's deep. There's lots of holes for resin and things to go down into. It honestly kind of looks like Rice Krispies made out of rocks when you zoom it in, coated in like honey or mustard. I don't know. It's weird, but it's cool and not at all what I expected. And so zooming in on something like this gives me better perspective onto why I think this polishes resin better. Maybe it lets it seep down on the inside a little bit better than sandpaper does, where there's not any room for the resin to go. I wanted to zoom in on this 2400 grit version here because it's very similar color to that 2000 grit sandpaper, so you can see the difference. It's still porous. There's lots of holes and places for water and things to go inside when you're sanding with water. This 12,000 grit, or their version of 12,000 grit, is still really hard to make out even at this 1000 times zoom. I sanded some resin on it so you could even see that there's a difference. The upper half has resin sanded on it and the bottom doesn't, because it's just blurry and hard to make out. It's crazy fine detailed, which I want to come back to because the Zona Paper never gets that fine a detail, but that's kind of a spoiler. When I zoom in here on the Zona Paper, I was actually wrong in my thoughts that the Zona Paper didn't have any rocks in them, at least for the 600 grit one. Perhaps that's because it's such low grit, the kind of threads that make up Zona Paper aren't enough, and they had to add these tiny little pebbles to help take away material much faster. I was kind of blown away at that. It looks so cool. I sanded some resin on it so you could see how it kind of catches against these tiny little materials. Honestly, I just think it's really awesome. This is my favorite close-up view of all these zoom-ins that we're going to do. I do want to show off this light blue one because it's around the same grit, or claims to be, as the sandpaper we were looking at 1800 grit. It's got this interesting top layer that's glued or painted blue, and that's kind of what I anticipated Zona Paper to be, just a bunch of threads that you're sanding against rather than rocks, because that is in general smoother. So this is really what I was anticipating, but it's got that weird kind of glued layer on the top and a bunch of really tiny threads behind it. So tiny, they actually are similar to this final Zona Paper that we're going to look at that's claimed to be 22,000 grit. All of these threads here look to be about the same size as the ones we just looked at on the blue, or light blue, Zona Paper. I think it's fascinating that we can make out so much more detail in this Zona Paper here that is claimed to be 10,000 grits higher than the highest grit Micromesh that we looked at. That's wild. I don't know why that is. I'm not smart enough to know these things. I just wanted to be able to show off why I think Zona Papers was cool and try and prove a hypothesis, you know, try and do some science and take a look at things, and I thought y'all might want to see that as well. However, if there are any industrial engineers or material science experts that can explain all of these things to me, let me know in the comments down below so that in the future I can actually sound smart and say, oh, here's why I prefer Zona Papers over others, because until now I've just been going on gut feeling, which is basically all I do on this channel. Anyway, I know this was a different kind of video. I just thought it was cool when I looked at these materials myself up close, and I thought you all might find it neat to look at one of our most used tools up close and personal. I have some dice planned for my next video, so subscribe so you don't miss that, assuming I can finish making them before Baldur's Gate 3 sucks me in too much. And, oh yeah, my kids, I guess. Thanks again for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day.